Around 250,000 years before our time, the world stood at the threshold of one of the most consequential but largely invisible events in human evolution: the first interbreeding between early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. For over 200,000 years, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were interbreeding, with Neanderthals inheriting at least 10% Homo sapiens DNA, totally destroying the simplistic out-of-Africa narrative which told us that modern humans never left the African cradle until 50,000 years ago. In fact, this subject has been raised by David Reich, one of the leading geneticists in the world.
The question that I have is, do we still have a fundamentally wrong model of archaic modern human relationships? This is approximately the picture we now have, without even talking about the recent gene flow between Neanderthals and modern humans in New Guinea, Melanesia, and out of Africa. There's substructure in Africa, there is a deep lineage going into Denisovans, and the standard model has this very interesting event that I hadn't talked about, which is about 5% contribution of African modern humans to Neanderthals about 300,000 years ago. However, the mitochondrial DNA you get from your mother and the Y chromosome you get from your father, these are, in Neanderthals, something that's related within 300,000 or 400,000 years to modern humans. So if you believe this model, it must come from this event. The probability of that happening is 5% times 5%, so a very, very small number. It's been argued that maybe natural selection for the modern human mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, which was better adapted, could explain this, but other work has shown that the rest of the genome for modern humans was strongly selected against. So it's a very strange story. So it makes one think, are we missing something important, and is there an alternative configuration about the relationships amongst these lineages that might explain the data? Maybe if we think very hard, we'll find it, or maybe we'll cut some Gordian knot and get more ancient DNA.
Although the study and media reports suggest that interbreeding happened 250,000 years ago, and then again 100,000 years ago, and then again 50,000 years ago, the more plausible scenario is that modern humans were outside of Africa all of that time. Indeed, that is the most parsimonious and harmonious explanation, not multiple failed migrations and extinctions. This is not speculation, it is the exact model discussed by Dr. Reich. But most media outlets only repeat standard, increasingly improbable narratives of multiple failed migrations. Maybe you still believe the National Geographic version that modern humans are a pure, untainted species that evolved in an African Garden of Eden. But that story is genetically, geographically, and historically impossible. Homo sapiens is an Afro-Eurasian species, and that concept is not anti-Africa. It proves that modern humans didn't require a sudden spark of intelligence to leave Africa. We have always been a dynamic, intercontinental species. Humans have been living on both sides of the mythical Red Sea barrier between Africa and Eurasia since time immemorial. The narrow land bridge between Africa and Eurasia became a humid, green, passable corridor during a rare window in the middle Pleistocene climate cycle. It summoned early Homo sapiens northward, carrying with them genetic variations that had never before been seen in Neanderthal populations. These early humans encountered Neanderthals, or their immediate ancestors, and the two populations blended. And this had profound implications. The line between Homo sapiens and Neanderthal is blurrier than we are told. In fact, Neanderthals could be Homo sapiens, or Eurasians may be modernized Neanderthals. In fact, rather than this event being the result of Homo sapiens migrating from Africa into Neanderthal territory, Neanderthals from Europe may have migrated into Homo sapiens territory in the eastern Mediterranean Levantine region. Whatever happened, the genetic legacy of that encounter would persist for 200,000 years, shaping every Neanderthal across their entire geographic range. Don't be fooled into believing that hybridization is something that nobody imagined until the genetic revolution. Hybridization was theorized by anthropologists nearly 100 years ago, but their work was buried in favor of a simplistic, almost biblical origin story. In fact, the idea of Homo sapiens being a completely pure species that evolved in total isolation is so completely against all the laws of nature that early scientists would rise from their graves if they knew what has been taught for the last 4 decades. And although the fossils that directly represent the hybrid population remain scarce, the astonishing early modern human skull at Apidema in Greece demonstrates that this early dispersal of our species was real, widespread, and fully capable of reaching deep into Eurasia long before the later waves that ultimately took over the world. To understand how early modern humans lived in the region at such an ancient date, we must begin with climate. Between roughly 244,000 and 190,000 years ago, the Earth passed through a warm interglacial phase composed of several humid peaks. During this time, the Levant was not the desert it is today. Strengthened African monsoons, driven by higher summer insolation, transformed the Afro-Arabia region into a network of lakes, rivers, grasslands, and open woodlands. This green Arabia was rich with zebras, gazelles, antelopes, hippos, and other large mammals that expanded north and east following rainfall belts. Early Homo sapiens, likely living in northeastern Africa, were tied to these ecological corridors. As the both sides of the Red Sea region filled with life, humans could migrate not as explorers facing deserts, but as hunters and foragers moving through savanna landscapes. The Red Sea provided a permanent artery of habitability, and from the Nile Delta, the northern Sinai corridor opened in humid phases, allowing both animals and humans to cross into Eurasia. The region responded dramatically to the moisture. Speleothem records from caves show increases in rainfall, and pollen deposits reveal a mosaic of oak and pistachio woodlands, Mediterranean scrublands, and rich grasslands. Water flowed year-round in the Jordan Rift. Caves along the Carmel Ridge, Tabun, Mislia, Kafse, Skul, offered shelter, stable temperatures, and predictable ecological niches. This region became not just a crossing point, but a thriving habitat that could support long-term human occupation. Crucially, Neanderthals also lived here, moving in from the north during the same climate windows. The region was not merely a passageway, it was a meeting ground. Thus, the stage was set for the first known blending of distinct human lineages. Early Homo sapiens, emerging from Africa during this time, encountered Neanderthal populations occupying the same hillsides, caves, and hunting territories. The encounters were not sudden or violent. They were gradual, ecological, and social. Two populations accustomed to different histories found themselves sharing fresh water, overlapping hunting routes, and competing or cooperating over the same high-value caves. Over generations, gene flow took place. It may have been driven by occasional intermarriage, by exchanges between small bands, or by the incorporation of isolated individuals into neighbouring communities. The number of actual hybrid pairings required was quite small. Because Neanderthals had extremely small effective population sizes, only about 2,300 to 3,400 individuals across their whole range, even a handful of hybrid children per millennium, would leave a deep imprint on their gene pool. Genomic evidence tells the rest of the story. When researchers examined the genomes of 3 high-coverage Neanderthals, the Vindiger Neanderthal from Croatia, the Altai Neanderthal from Siberia, and the Chagirskaya Neanderthal, they discovered long segments of DNA with unusually high heterozygosity and modern human-like mutation patterns. These segments are not compatible with Neanderthal ancestry alone. They represent the signature of early Homo sapiens. And because all 3 Neanderthals, living at different times and in locations separated by thousands of kilometers, carry these segments, the admixture must have occurred before their lineages split. That places the gene flow precisely between 250,000 and 200,000 years ago, exactly when the green corridor was open. This admixture was substantial. Modelling of the genomes reveals that Neanderthals originally received between 5 and 10% of their genome from early Homo sapiens. Only about 2.5 to 3.7% remains identifiable today in late Neanderthals because recombination gradually erases the traces of ancient hybridization. But the original contribution was large, much larger than the amount of Neanderthal DNA modern humans received in the later, well-known admixture around 60,000 years ago. In other words, early Homo sapiens left a deeper genetic mark on Neanderthals than Neanderthals eventually left on us. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the admixture concerns which genes were transferred. The Homo sapiens-derived DNA in Neanderthals is not random. It clusters in certain functional categories. Many of the introgressed genes are involved in neuronal signaling, synaptic behavior, learning pathways, and ion channel regulation. Genes essential for excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission appear in Neanderthal genomes only within the human-derived segments. These genes affect synaptic plasticity, memory formation, developmental timing, and neural excitability. Their persistence for 200,000 years suggests that they were not deleterious to Neanderthals, and may have provided subtle advantages, perhaps increasing behavioral flexibility or broadening neurological diversity in a population otherwise constrained by low genetic variation. As early Homo sapiens interacted with Neanderthals, some groups pushed farther north and west. Climatic conditions were favorable across the eastern Mediterranean, and the coastline offered rich marine resources. One of the most important fossils in this discussion is the Apidima 1 skull from the Mani Peninsula in southern Greece. Although deformed by geological processes, Apidima 1 clearly preserves traits associated with modern humans: a rounded globular skull vault and the absence of a Neanderthal occipital bun. Its age, between 210,000 and 240,000 years old, places it directly in the same time frame as the admixture event. It proves that early Homo sapiens had expanded into southeastern Europe long before the successful migration years later. The Apidima cave system contains a second skull as well, Apidima 2, a classic Neanderthal dated to around 170,000 years ago. This juxtaposition is remarkable. A modern human at 240,000 to 210,000 years ago, followed by a Neanderthal at 170,000 years ago, both in the same cave complex. The simplest interpretation is that early Homo sapiens briefly expanded into Greece, but later Neanderthals replaced them. Yet it also supports the idea that the early Homo sapiens population responsible for the admixture was not confined to a small region. It had the capacity to spread across Eurasia's southern arc in small scattered groups. Whether Apidima 1 represents a direct participant in the admixture or a sister lineage, its existence confirms that early Homo sapiens movements into Eurasia were real and geographically broad. The disappearance of early Homo sapiens from Greece suggests that climatic reversal or Neanderthal competition eventually pushed them out. This gave way to cooler conditions, shrinking the woodland belt and reducing the ecological zones that connected Africa to Eurasia. Neanderthals, adapted to more seasonal environments and already established in Europe, reoccupied Greece by 170,000 years ago. But although the early Homo sapiens in Greece vanished, their relatives to the south had already left their genetic imprint on Neanderthals. When Neanderthal populations later expanded or shifted across Eurasia into the Caucasus, Siberia, and Europe, they carried with them the Homo sapiens alleles they had acquired in the earlier interbreeding. These alleles, particularly in neurological pathways, became universal features of Neanderthal genomes. As interglacial periods faded, the region fell under alternating control of Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens populations. But the first admixture event remained a defining genetic milestone. It affected the evolution of Neanderthals over more than 2,000 centuries. It may have influenced their sensory processing, developmental timing, or adaptive flexibility in ways that are subtle but real. It also set a precedent for future interactions. The story of this early admixture thus connects climate, migration, fossils, and genetics into a single narrative. A rare interglacial window opened. Early humans crossed. They met their northern relatives. They blended, they dispersed, and a fragment of their biology became part of Neanderthal identity. Apidima 1 stands as a lonely sentinel of this vast movement, proof that early modern humans were not confined to Africa or even the Middle East, but had roamed into Europe's sunlit peninsulas during a watery green Pleistocene phase that is gone forever. When the window closed, they retreated or died out, but their genetic imprint remained, an imprint carried by every Neanderthal who lived afterward. This is not the world predicted by the Out of Africa model, which imagined a pure, untainted, true human species suddenly emerging and replacing all others. The irony is striking. The very scholars whose ideas were dismissed as old-fashioned or overly broad were in many respects closest to the truth. Meanwhile, the tidy, linear, replacement-driven model of human origins, once hailed as a triumph of modern science, now appears increasingly like an intellectual dead end. It was elegant, simple and appealing, but ultimately incompatible with the messy reality of evolution. The assumption that Homo sapiens arose in genetic purity, untouched by admixture, shielded from contact, and possessing a unique essence that set them apart from all other hominins, now reads less like science and more like a comforting myth. It is therefore not an exaggeration to say that the pure species interpretation of Homo sapiens will one day be viewed as a concept that set anthropology back decades. It constrained scholars to simplify the past, to force fossils into rigid categories, and to ignore the evidence of continuity that had been noted by earlier anatomists. It encouraged an almost biblical obsession with a singular birthplace and a chosen lineage, rather than embracing the evolutionary principles of diversity, population structure, and gene flow. As ancient DNA studies continue to deepen, the synthesis between anatomy and genetics becomes even more prescient. The one-species hypothesis does not imply that all humans were identical. It implies that all humans were connected. It anticipates a world in which regional populations diverged and converged repeatedly, sharing genes and traits while adapting to their specific environments. It explains transitional fossils such as Jebel Irhoud, mosaic populations like those at Mount Carmel, and the broad continuum of forms across the Pleistocene. In this framework, human evolution becomes not a sequence of cleanly separated stages, but a web of relationships. Modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and African archaics were not separate experiments in evolution, but branches of a single, sprawling family tree whose roots and branches intertwined across the continents. It is a vision that honors the complexity of our past and aligns with the genetic data now emerging from every corner of the globe. The future of paleoanthropology will continue to move towards this integrated perspective. As more fossils are discovered, more DNA extracted, and more models refined, the picture that emerges will look increasingly like the Neanderthal, and modern forms, once believed by some to be distinct species, are instead variations within a single human continuum.